بالله زرت المغاني مرة.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to the first episode of iJihad. In this show, we will be examining a set of videos by a relatively popular Dutch YouTuber by the name of Griffix. She is known for her content regarding the supposed dangers of Islamic fundamentalism, and how it supports, justifies, and in many cases, directly leads to the violent imposition of Islamic values onto others, otherwise known as radicalization. Her views are also supported by a popular German YouTuber by the name of KrautNT, who has even sponsored some of her videos on his own channel. As such, it would be fair to consider this rebuttal as killing two birds with one stone. So the first video we will be looking at is called Islam When the Facts Are Against You. Now, given that Griffix doesn't present her arguments in any systematic fashion, for the sake of brevity, we won't be playing the entirety of her videos. Rather, we will only be showing those parts which present her primary points, and then respond accordingly. So let's jump right in.
What you see here is an article on the Dutch news outlet called nu.nl. It is about a recent meeting between politicians and experts regarding the topic of radicalization and jihadism. During this meeting, a few interesting facts were discussed, which inspired this article to be written and inspired me to do a video about it. Now, one of the people mentioned in this piece is Professor Paul Scheffer. Paul Scheffer is a 61-year-old political scientist and Labour Party member who wrote books like The Multicultural Drama, which you might or might not have read. You by now might understand why Professor Scheffer was invited to speak here. He knows a lot about topics like integration, and it won't surprise you that he brought some rather interesting facts to the table. And by rather interesting, I mean deeply disturbing. As it turns out, 50% of Dutch Muslims believe that democracy and Islam are incompatible. That's right, I'll repeat that again. 50% of Dutch Muslims believe that democracy and Islam are incompatible. Now, most of Scheffer's data, including this specific percentage, was based upon research conducted by Professor Ruud Koopmans. I managed to find a relevant paper and propose we go through the data together.
Within the very first minute of her video, she has already made an error. How so? Because the claim that 50% of Dutch Muslims believe that Islam and democracy are incompatible does not exist in the supposedly relevant paper she references. The specific study in question, authored by Dutch sociologist Ruud Koopmans, titled Religious Fundamentalism and Outgroup Hostility Among Muslims and Christians in Western Europe, nowhere mentions the word incompatible, nor the phrase not compatible. And where it does mention the word democracy, it refers to a statement within a previous study about German Muslims who believe that following the prescriptions of my religion is more important than democracy. So not only is the claim in question absent from the study altogether, but the closest thing to it doesn't even refer to Dutch Muslims nor the incompatibility of their religious sentiments with democracy. And I can say with a great deal of confidence that the words more important and incompatible are not synonymous, no matter how hard one tries to play with semantics. For example, imagine if someone said, my family is more important than democracy. To then conclude that said person's family is incompatible with democracy would be ludicrous.
As Scheffer said, a disturbingly large minority seems to believe that religious laws are more important than the judicial system of the Netherlands. Now, when he said that, what he meant, to be more specific, is that 43% of Dutch Muslims seem to believe that religious laws are more important than the secular laws of the state. Now, 43% is indeed a disturbingly large minority, and if I can be more specific, that is a minority that is 8 digits away from being a small majority.
Once again, this quote is in reference to previous research and is not actually part of the study itself. However, what Griffix appears to be implying is that because Muslims believe their religious obligations, such as praying 5 times a day, dressing modestly, eating halal food, fasting for the month of Ramadan, etc., are more important than Dutch laws, that this means that they are prone to criminal behavior. However, this is a non sequitur. And what is a non sequitur? Well, our trusty logic lamp can help us answer that. A non sequitur is a fallacy of logic which literally translates to does not follow. It occurs when the premises of an argument do not form a necessary connection to the conclusion. To make this more clear, an analogy can be made with Westerners who live and work in Muslim-majority countries, such as Malaysia and the UAE. Now, I'm 100% certain that most expats value the laws of their home countries far more than those countries they work and reside in. However, it would be absurd for me to conclude, by virtue of this sentiment alone, that they are therefore more prone to committing criminal offenses. To be fair, though, Griffiths may point out the fact that Muslim immigrants, particularly from Morocco, are far more prone to poverty and criminal behavior than any other group in the Netherlands. However, this is irrelevant, because no credible studies consider religiosity to be a factor behind this phenomenon. And that's not surprising given that no control groups have yet to be set up to compare Muslim immigrant behavior on a global scale. For instance, if we were to compare the situation in the Netherlands with that of the United States, we would find very different results. Muslim immigrants in the US tend to do as well as the majority, sometimes even better, despite being less than 1% of the population. And unlike the Netherlands, it has no forceful policies requiring immigrants to quote-unquote integrate. In other words, a credible researcher would be less likely to blame religion for this problem, and more likely to find fault with Dutch society itself.
Now, the same study also provided us with this graph, which I used in one of my most recent videos on Islam, and which you are probably familiar with if you are subscribed to Dr. Lehman. What this graph says is that roughly 60% of foreign-born and native-born immigrant generations think Muslims should return to the roots of Islam. 75% think only one interpretation of the Quran is possible. Now, let's do away with this graph and look at another one. This one, for instance. This graph doesn't show us the level of fundamentalism amongst Christians and Muslims, but instead shows us the outgroup hostility. And what they mean by that is, for instance, how members of these groups think about, for instance, gay people or Jews. If we take the first and second generation of immigrants together, like I did in the last graph, we are looking at 57% of Muslims who would reject homosexual friends. 45% do not trust Jews, and 54% see the West as this enemy that is just out to destroy Islam.
Here, Griffiths shows some data on certain beliefs and attitudes of first and second generation Muslim immigrants in the Netherlands. Apparently, these results are problematic. Never mind the fact that recent studies have shown much more outgroup hostility among native Dutch than Muslim immigrants.
Now, as someone who has worked as a teacher, I know flooding you with data will probably be counterproductive, so I will leave it at that.
Let me get this straight. Showing 3 excerpts from one academic paper is flooding people with information? Talk about insulting the intelligence of your audience.
Pause the video if you have to, and please absorb this information. Try to comprehend what these statistics are telling you. We have a problem, okay? And when I say we, I don't just mean the Dutch. I mean all of us, Europeans and to an extent Americans as well.
So, apparently there's a problem with having fundamentalist views. Unfortunately, Griffiths doesn't actually tell us what that problem is in this video. All she offers as evidence are some anecdotes about how some people were murdered in the Netherlands or had to leave.
Now, I think the Netherlands, in case that wasn't clear yet, and its Islamic population have a lot of problems that need to be solved. And these problems can't be solved unless we start discussing them fairly. As long as we lie about the cause of fundamentalism or the severity of the issue that it poses us with, we will continue to be part of the problem. And for everyone who has ever doubted that, allow me to remind you of Dutch politician Pim Fortuyn, or also a Dutchman, Ayaan Hirsi Ali's friend and filmmaker Theo van Gogh. Regardless of what you think of these two gentlemen, they were killed, slaughtered, because they spoke their minds about the topic of Islam. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali Well, thank God nothing happened to her, but she had to leave the country several years ago because she felt like she wasn't safe here anymore.
I'm a bit confused about the example she offers regarding the supposed consequences of Muslim fundamentalism. For instance, Pim Fortuyn was not killed by a Muslim extremist, let alone a Muslim to begin with. He was assassinated by a non-Muslim Dutch national by the name of Volker van de Graaf, who murdered him because he thought he was going to be the next Hitler. Yes, this was prompted by Fortuyn's anti-Muslim sentiments, but his death had no connection whatsoever to religious fundamentalism. Another example brought up was Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who did not leave the Netherlands because she felt scared of Muslim fundamentalists. She left because the government found out she had lied on her asylum applications, and she feared they'd force her out of the country. She never wanted to leave the Netherlands to begin with, but she felt coerced to do so by virtue of something completely unrelated to Muslim extremism. She even states this herself on her biography page at her current place of work. As for Theo van Gogh, well, we'll touch up more on that at a later point. For now, let's continue.
I'd also like to remind you that there is no such thing as Buddhismophobia or Hinduophobia. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is no coincidence. The fact that Islam isn't exactly popular to begin with has something to do with the experiences people have with Islam. And surely anti-Muslim bigotry can widen the gap between Muslims and non-Muslims even further. I'm not excusing actual discrimination against Muslims. I mean, I'm a liberal. I oppose any form of discrimination. But it cannot hurt to ask ourselves the question why there is bigotry towards Muslims and not against, say, Chinese people. As Paul Scheffer put it, when the Muslim community asks us to be tolerant of Islam, I answer yes. But then I will ask them if they are tolerant of Dutch society. Are they willing to accept the equality between men and women? Are they willing to accept our homosexuals?
What I don't think Griffiths realizes is that the answer to her question regarding why there is more bigotry against Muslims as opposed to other groups is in the very statement she quotes from Paul Schaefer, and not in the way she probably thinks. You see, tolerance is about coexisting with others while being able to disagree with them. It's not about acceptance. However, Griffiths appears to be implying that unless you agree that sodomy is morally virtuous, and actively go out of your way to be BFFs with homosexuals, drinking alcohol and eating pork sandwiches with them, then you're not being tolerant. I could be wrong here, so I'm open to correction, but it does appear that the whole Dutch policy of integration is far more concerned with forced conversion than tolerance. Now, as a fundamentalist Muslim myself, who in many respects only subscribes to one interpretation of my religion, I don't agree with this version of tolerance. In fact, I think it's very possible to respect and act justly with people I disagree with, without ever feeling the need to impose my values onto them. This belief of mine is exemplified in the Quran itself. However, according to Griffiths, apparently there is a problem with me having only one interpretation of my religion, and that I should quote-unquote reform myself by considering additional interpretations that are far more quote-unquote enlightened. Well, pardon me for feeling hesitant at such a suggestion. And for those of you shouting at the screen that these verses have been abrogated because the supposedly more violent verses revealed in Medina cancel out the more peaceful ones revealed in Mecca, I'm afraid that doesn't work on me. Not only is that a completely unsubstantiated exegetical approach, but even if it were correct, it would not apply in this instance. Why? Because these verses were revealed in Medina, not Mecca. Now, after watching this video, I came to the conclusion that Griffiths is attempting to argue the following. Fundamentalist beliefs lead Muslims to justify and support the violent imposition of Islam onto others, and in many cases, even leads them directly to violence. However, so as not to strawman my opposition, I searched for another relevant video by Griffiths in order to confirm this interpretation. Lo and behold, I came across her video titled Regressive, Radicalization Doesn't Exist, where she argues against a reporter from Al Jazeera regarding the existence and nature of radicalization. Therein, she states the following.
We will only call a Muslim radical when he or she is a religious fanatic that holds a very literal interpretation of Islamic scripture and has views that make it very hard for him or her to ever coexist with Westerners in a Western country. And there are huge problems with young Muslim men who radicalize and at some point even leave the country to go join ISIS. and don't even come with geopolitical and social economic circumstances. Yes, those do play a part in the problems that we are having in the Middle East, but I am talking about Muslims who were born and raised in Western countries and who often come from a good family. Their families are westernized, they speak the language, they are very laid back and liberal with their religion, and are sometimes even studying in universities. And all of a sudden, it just goes wrong. This happened to a kid from my town. He was probably the most liberal Muslim I've ever met, but during the summer break he locked himself up in his room watching God knows what videos, and then he joined ISIS. He even made a video in Iraq announcing his suicide, after which he blew himself up in Baghdad near a police station, killing dozens of people. This guy was so incredibly nice, but something turned him into a monster, and that something is called religion. But look, I agree with you. Not all Muslims are like that. Not all Muslims radicalize and go out to kill the infidels, gays, and disobeying women. However, that doesn't mean they are completely off the hook, because although practicing jihadists form a minority, the groups that silently condone these practices are much, much bigger and form a majority in pretty much every Muslim country.
So this seems like confirmation enough. Given everything Griffiths has stated thus far, I think we can safely render her theory of radicalization as follows. Step 1. First, you need a vacuum. Step 2. Take a normal liberal person and put them inside the vacuum. Step 3. Add some religion. Step 4. Then, well, step 4 is, I guess the religion forces itself onto the person's mind, or I don't know. I guess we'll just call this step magic. And finally, voila! Evil terrorist who wants to kill infidels.
It was on that day I put a jihad on them. And if you don't believe it, then you better kill me now, because I'll put a jihad on you too.
And no, I wasn't trying to make her position look absurd, because this is precisely what it is. However, to be fair, we should examine the evidences she utilizes in support of it. So first, let's look at what she thinks about radicalization.
And there's no set criteria for what the process of radicalization even looks like.
Except for the fact that there are. Just because you didn't do the research to find this out doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Or what a radical actually is.
There are criteria for that. Once again, you not doing the research doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
And continuing to talk about radicalization without any set criteria.
We do have set criteria, you just didn't do your research.
Here, Griffiths makes yet another error. You see, the graph she uses is from an unclassified 2006 FBI study titled The Radicalization Process from Conversion to Jihad, which presents a linear pathway from religiosity to violence. This same report was echoed over a year later in a 2007 FBI law enforcement bulletin. However, there is a major problem with this study. Why? Because the FBI has since rejected this model. You see, in their 2014 law enforcement bulletin, in an article titled The New Approach to Countering Violent Extremism, the FBI now claims to hold an entirely different position. Behavioral experts hypothesize that violent extremism possesses similarities to other modes of social behavior and developmental models. Most notably, violent extremism is not a linear progression, but an evolving dynamic situation involving numerous factors, catalyst, inhibitors, and mobilization variables. And you know what's most interesting about the FBI's new understanding of the radicalization process? Nowhere is the word religion proclaimed as the all-encompassing answer to the problem. In other words, had Griffiths taken just a couple of minutes to verify her sources, rather than waste time accusing others of not researching, she would have not made this blunder. Perhaps in the future, she should follow her own advice.
The fact that you find something on the internet does not mean that you can hold that thing up and yell that this is representative for the rest of society. That's a very important thing that you need to keep in the back of your head before you take things like this and use them to support your claims.
But maybe I'm being a little too harsh. I guess I just expect a lot from people who come off as thinking themselves autodidact polymaths simply by virtue of lacking a belief in God and having an internet connection. But that's besides the point, because Griffiths doesn't even find this discrepancy problematic. As she says herself, precise definitions and criteria really don't matter.
And even if there weren't any set criteria, what would your point be? That just because of a gap in the definition of the word radical, the phenomenon isn't real, so therefore we should just ignore it?
Well, actually, that may be entirely reasonable, because definitions do matter. You see, if I claim that something called a gobbledygook existed, and then you asked me to give you a definition or a set criteria for determining what that was, and I responded to you, I don't know, then the first thing that would come to your mind is, well, then how can I know it exists? And while such a thing could possibly exist despite not having a set definition or criteria, to claim that it most certainly does exist would be a textbook example of incoherence. And what I find most surprising about Griffith's nonchalant attitude about the definition of radicalization is that she often criticizes social justice warriors, particularly feminists, for their imprecise use of language to demonize their opposition.
Well, with that, I think a lot of students are scared of calling them out as well because they don't want to be labeled terms like racist or sexist. And I think that has a massive sway in the minds of a lot of students who don't necessarily like what's going on at the moment.
The word racist or sexist is basically like pushing a big red button and you completely detonate the conversation. And this is such a powerful weapon because you can completely derail a discussion. The moment you if I would be a social justice warrior and we would be debating and you say something that I can't debunk, or you give me an argument that I can't say anything against, all I have to do is say, you're just doing this because you're a sexist, and then I win. It's too easy and it works, and I hope that the effect will wear off in the future.
In other words, Griffiths is okay with requiring set criteria for a concept when she means to utilize it as a point of contention, but when it comes to her own use of definitions, convenience becomes the standard. And this is really only the beginning of the problem, because not only is it ludicrous to constantly talk about something you can't define, but it's especially dangerous when you want to create government policies on the basis of it. For instance, the British counter-terrorism strategy known as PREVENT has come under attack recently for not only lacking standard procedures of peer review, but also because of its highly dubious methodology and erroneous conclusions. I mean, if your entire analysis of a problem is based on vague interviews with 20 convicts, yes, 20 convicts, it's difficult to reasonably justify why this should be applied to the broader population, especially when some of the victims of this policy have been children as young as 4 years old, interrogated and harassed for their innocuous statements and behaviors. So for Griffiths to basically assert that it's not a problem that we don't have set criteria for what constitutes as radicalization is not only irrational, but it's morally irresponsible. Other evidences she uses also run contrary to her theory. For instance, she presents the following statistics.
What I have right here is one of the many trustworthy polls that you can find on the internet regarding this topic. Now, this Pew poll shows us the support for Sharia law per Muslim country.
This graph is from a Pew poll study from 2013 called The World's Muslims, Religion, Politics, and Society. Griffiths uses this data to suggest that support for Sharia automatically makes Muslims extremists supportive of or directly affiliated with groups like ISIS. But once again, there is no evidence for this. And in fact, the evidence points to the contrary. For one, Griffiths fails to mention that within the very same study she uses, it shows that the majority of Muslims believe that Sharia should only apply to Muslims. And among those that support Sharia being applied to everyone, there is no data on whether or not this should be done by force or by vote. However, Chapter 2 of this same study gives us some clues. You see, the majority of Muslims also happen to believe that religious freedom for non-Muslims is a good thing. And in another Pew study, that same majority has negative opinions of groups like ISIS. Griffiths then goes on to cite yet another Pew study in support of her theory.
Are suicide bombings justifiable? Next statistic, also a Pew poll. Note the second section, against Americans and Westerners in Iraq. Look at that. Why not? Why not just bomb them? Why not just blow yourself up?
Again, Griffiths is being disingenuous. Firstly, she is using an entirely different Pew study to show Muslim sentiments towards suicide bombing, despite the fact that the previous poll she used already showcases that the majority of Muslims are opposed to it. Secondly, the poll she references here is from a 2004 Pew study titled A Year After Iraq War. In other words, the reasons for the favorable opinions towards suicide bombings in Iraq is a direct response to the illegal and unjust war against the Iraqi population by the United States and its allies. In other words, the targets of these suicide bombings are not just some random American tourist who just happened to be vacationing in Iraq, as Griffiths would have you believe, but people actively engaged in invading and killing innocent Iraqis. In other words, what Griffiths has done here is nothing less than morally repugnant. Now, I'm not one to support suicide bombings because I believe Islam opposes acts of suicide. However, I cannot conceive of any valid moral sentiment that thinks it's wrong for people to defend themselves against an unjust occupying military force, which to this day has led to the deaths of at least 250,000 people, not to mention the rise of ISIS. And maybe that number doesn't sound so big to people like Griffiths because it didn't happen in France, but I assure you, this tragedy is far too great to compensate with Facebook profile filters.
This lady are statistics, and statistics are not bigoted. Statistics are not racist. Statistics are not politically or emotionally motivated, because facts don't care about your feelings. This is simply the data that is available to us, and I hope I'm not the only one who finds this incredibly concerning. So no, not all Muslims are extremists, and certainly not in Western countries. But way too many are, especially in predominantly Islamic countries. So no, not all Muslims are extremists, but still way too many are. Even within Western countries, the numbers are scary.
Yes, statistics aren't bigoted, but people like Griffiths can be bigoted, especially when they claim that the majority of Muslims are extremists that support groups like ISIS. And so far, Griffiths' analysis on the evidence has been littered with errors, not to mention baseless implications. I mean, if we were to visualize what the data is saying versus what Griffiths thinks the data is saying, it might look something like this. What the data says, what Griffiths thinks the data says. What the data says, what Griffiths thinks the data says. What the data says, what Griffiths thinks the data says. But it gets worse, especially when we examine the most contemporary research on the subject of radicalization. You see, there are actual reasons why the Al Jazeera reporter claimed it doesn't exist. And those same reasons are what prompted the FBI to change their views as well. And those reasons reveal an inconvenient truth that many people are going to have to face before solving this problem. If you liked this video, please subscribe and share it. You may also follow the Andalusian Project on Facebook, Twitter, or WordPress. More importantly though, we would like to encourage everyone watching this video to donate to Islamic Relief and UNICEF for their ongoing efforts to helping those currently suffering in Syria and Iraq. Both these organizations have an excellent track record of providing for those who have been made vulnerable due to conflict, especially children and women. If you choose to donate, your money will go towards their efforts in ensuring that people are given food, proper medical treatment, and shelter. And if you choose not to donate, we only ask that you find it in your heart to give to another cause just as worthy. Thank you, and may Allah bless those who give and those who are in need.